Good morning. My name is Lauren Mora, and I'm a survey analyst at the Public Policy Institute of California. Welcome to our virtual program today, featuring the findings of our latest PPIC statewide survey on Californians and their government. The survey is supported with funding from the RJR and Francis F. Miller Foundation, and today's event is supported with funding from the PPIC Corporate Circle and the PPIC Donor Circle. We'd like to thank them for their support. For today's program, my colleague, Dean Bonner, will walk through some of the findings from today's survey, and then we will discuss a few key takeaways before answering questions from the audience. If you have a question, please send it along with your name and organization to the email address on the screen, ppiceventquestions@gmail.com. And as a reminder, PPIC is a public charity and does not take or support positions on any ballot measures or legislation, nor does it support, endorse, or oppose any political parties or candidates for public office. I'd now like to welcome my colleague, Associate Survey Director and Senior Fellow, Dean Bonner.
Thank you very much, Lauren. And while I'm sharing my screen, I do want to acknowledge the other authors of this report. Lauren, of course, as well as Survey Director Mark Baldessari and Survey Analyst Stasia Thomas. I would also like to acknowledge the funder of this survey, the RJR and Francis F. Miller Foundation. Prior to discussing this particular survey, I'd like to take a moment to talk a little bit about the mission of the statewide survey. And that is really to provide relevant, nonpartisan, and timely data on economic, social, and political opinions, which we hope will be used to improve state policy making, raise awareness, and encourage discussion. The statewide survey began back in 1998. It has contacted or interviewed over 420,000 Californians in over 200 regional, issue-specific, as well as general surveys like the one we have today. This particular survey is part of the Californians in Government series. It's a series that focuses on state and national and sometimes international issues, on public perceptions, attitudes, as well as policy preferences. This particular survey was fielded May 23rd through June 2nd using the Ipsos Knowledge Panel. We contacted just shy of 1,700 adult Californians, and that group has a margin of error of 3.1%. And the likely voter sample was just shy of 1,100, and the margin of error for that is 3.7%. So prior to diving into the election topics, which I'm sure most people are probably interested in, I really wanted to set the context and discuss how Californians are feeling today. And as it has been for the last 2 years, cost of living, economy, and inflation is the top issue mentioned by Californians. And it's noteworthy that we really haven't seen this high of a share going to a single topic since February 2021, when COVID was named as the top issue. Today, other issues mentioned most prevalent by Californians include housing cost and availability, homelessness, crime and drugs, as well as government in general. However, it's important to note that economic mentions is the top issue mentioned across parties, regions, and demographic groups, really highlighting how pervasive the feeling is on this topic. And when asked to name the top problem facing the nation today, we once again see that cost of living is the top issue. Cost of living, economy, and inflation is the top issue. Another 1 in 5 mention government in general, and 1 in 10 say immigration. Beyond that, there's once again mention of crime and drugs. At the national level, we're seeing democracy and elections mentioned by 5% and 7% of likely voters. And there are some folks who also mention homelessness and housing cost as the top issue facing the nation. Economic concerns are the top issue across most groups, although it is noteworthy that Republicans are about as likely to say immigration as they are economic concerns or government in general. So that's obviously something that's striking a chord with that group. And continue to look at the mood of Californians, we find that most Californians offer a pessimistic assessment of both the direction and the economic outlook for the state and the nation. These assessments are broadly held, with more respondents offering a pessimistic than optimistic view on these 4 questions across parties, regions, and demographic groups, with only one real exception, and that's with 60% of Democrats saying that the state is heading in the right direction. It's noteworthy that on all of these, we find that younger Californians, as well as those who are less educated and less affluent, are the most likely to be pessimistic in their views. Given that we've seen cost of living and inflation being a big issue when asked of Californians, we want to kind of see how concerned they are about this. And today we found that over half of Californians report being very concerned about the price of food and consumer goods today, while another 35% say they're somewhat concerned. Republicans are more likely than independents, and especially more likely than Democrats, to be very concerned about this. And we find that majorities across regions and demographic groups report being very concerned, with the exception of those in the San Francisco Bay Area and college graduates. Lower income Californians are far more likely than those making $80,000 or more to be very concerned. And there's a similar trend when we look at education, although not quite as pronounced. Notably, findings across age groups are similar, which oftentimes there are differences across age groups. In this case, the share being very concerned is relatively similar. And another issue, which was named by Californians as a top issue facing the state, is the strain that housing is the concept of housing prices and availability. And we find the majority of Californians saying that the cost of housing is placing a financial strain on their family today, with 3 in 10 saying that it's actually a lot of strain. Differences between Republicans and Democrats are not as great as we saw in the last question. However, we do find a majority of independents saying that housing costs place a strain on them. Across regions, despite some of the highest housing costs in the state, those in the San Francisco Bay Area are the least likely to report financial strain. And that really matches up with some of the kind of rent burden data that is collected by the census and other groups. Given the high wages that are paid in the Bay Area, the strain on the housing isn't quite as great. There isn't as great of a burden. There are noteworthy subgroup differences with the strain, with strain decreasing as age, education, and income rises. And it's especially noteworthy that renters are nearly twice as likely as homeowners to say that housing is a strain overall, and they're nearly 3 times as likely to say it places a lot of strain on them. So turning to the November election, when asked about a potential 2020 rematch, we find that President Joe Biden leads former President Donald Trump by a 24-point margin. Since we began asking this question in June of last year, the margin has really ranged from 33 points back in June of 2023 to 23 points in February. The share saying they would vote for someone else today is currently 13%. So there is some appetite for a third party here. We find that 86% of Democrats support Joe Biden, 81% of Republicans support Donald Trump, while Biden leads 41 to 32 among independents. And that's a lead that has shrunk from 51 to 16 last June. So there has been some movement among independents. We find that support for President Biden is 9 points higher among women than men, and actually 43 points higher among college graduates than those without a college degree. And as you might know, there's an upcoming debate, one on June 27th and another on September 10th, presidential debates. And we find that 2 in 3 likely voters report being at least somewhat interested in this, but just 36% are very interested. And this is down very much so from September 2016, when 62% were very interested in the Clinton-Trump debates, and in 2020, when 57% were interested in the Biden-Trump debates. And looking at the U.S. Senate race between Adam Schiff and Steve Garvey, we see the Democratic Senator Schiff leading Republican baseball representative Garvey by 25 points. Today's findings are nearly identical to our first reading on this race when it was 61-37 in April. Both U.S. Senate candidates do slightly better than their presidential counterparts overall and within party support, which in some ways has to do with the fact that in this race, given the top two, there are only 2 choices, where there will be multiple choices in the presidential race. Among independents, Schiff leads Garvey by 8 points. And Schiff's support is 8 points higher among women than men and 18 points higher among college grads compared to those with a high school diploma or less. When asked about interest in potentially having a series of debates in town halls, just 20% report being very interested and 36% are somewhat interested. And I should note, at this time, there are no debates or town halls scheduled for the Senate candidates. And we also have been continuing to ask about support for a generic House candidate. And today we find results very similar to that of the Senate race, with Democratic support 26 points higher than Republican support. There's overwhelming support for their party's own candidates among partisans, while independents prefer the Democratic candidate to the Republican candidate by 12 points. When we only look at the 10 districts deemed competitive by the Cook Political Report, we find Democrats enjoying a 20-point lead, so slightly smaller than the overall lead. And when we look at kind of the subgroup differences, we see that Democratic candidates are favored to the Republican candidate across demographic groups. And when asked how enthusiastic they are about voting for Congress this year, we find that 3 in 10 likely voters report being extremely or very enthusiastic about voting for Congress this year. And that enthusiasm is slightly higher at 37% if we just look at the competitive districts. So the November ballot will likely be pretty full, with voters being asked to weigh in on quite a few measures. And while we won't know exactly what measures will be on the ballot until June 27th, when there is a deadline, we asked about 2 measures that the legislature has currently slated to appear on the ballot, both of which are constitutional amendments. The first, which has bipartisan majority support among likely voters, would require an initiative constitutional amendment proposing a 2/3 vote to also be approved by a two-thirds of voters. This measure would also authorize local governing bodies to hold an advisory vote on any issue with the purpose of allowing voters to voice their opinions on this issue. This measure has broad support, with the majority of likely voters across regions and demographic groups saying that they would vote yes. On the second measure, which divides partisans, this would replace the current 2/3 vote with a 55% majority vote to pass local taxes and bond measures for public infrastructure and affordable housing. While partisans are divided, there's actually majority opposition to this measure across regions and demographic groups, with the exception of those in Orange, San Diego, college graduates, and Latinos. Those three groups are actually closely divided. And then when you look at renters, they're actually more likely to favor to say they would vote yes than no. Now, there is another measure which could appear on the ballot. We're currently waiting on a decision from the California Supreme Court, which is supposed to be coming prior to the June 27th deadline. And this measure would require statewide election and a majority voter approval for new and increased taxes currently enacted by a 2/3 vote of the legislature. Additionally, it would limit voters' ability to pass voter-proposed local special taxes by raising the vote requirement to 2/3. And while there's somewhat uncertainty about what the California Supreme Court will decide, our survey actually shows a majority of likely voters, including bipartisan agreement, would vote no on this measure. And there is widespread agreement with majority opposition across regions and demographic groups. Now, just prior to the fielding of this survey, Governor Newsom released his May revision, which included $288 billion in spending and a $27.6 billion budget shortfall if you account for $17 billion, which had already been agreed upon with the legislature. As you may have seen, the legislature just passed their version of the budget, and so now while it has been passed, there will be some negotiation taking place. And when we ask Californians basically to gauge their overall opinions on the budget situation, and this is a question we've asked dating back to 2006, we found today that 42% of Californians call the budget situation a big problem, and another 49% say it's somewhat of a problem. Findings today are nearly identical to February when I believe it was 40% called it a big problem. And when we look at the partisan divide, we see that Republicans are by far the most likely to call the budget a big problem, with 73% holding this view, compared to about 3 in 10 Democrats and half of independents who say this. The share saying that the budget situation is a big problem is higher among whites than other racial ethnic groups and increases with age and income. As we've normally done after the May revise and the January budget proposal, we asked a question about the overall budget plan put forth by governors, in this case, Governor Newsom. And today we find that just over half of Californians and likely voters are in favor. 7 in 10 Democrats favor the budget plan, while 7 in 10 Republicans oppose it, and independents are divided. Residents in the San Francisco Bay Area and Los Angeles are the most likely to favor the plan, while those in the Inland Empire are the least likely. And support for the budget plan increases with rising education and income, while it is similar across similar across age groups. And we also asked about a couple of elements of the governor's plan that the governor is using to address the budget gap. And we find that Californians are divided on this, on using a combination of reductions, delayed spending, and shifts in funding sources. About half of Californians and likely voters say this is a good idea. And on the use of $4.2 billion from the state's reserve to partially address the current budget, we find that they're a little more divided. Republicans are more likely than Democrats and independents to support cuts, delayed spending, and funding shifts, while Democrats are far more likely to support funding reserves. When we asked similar questions in our February survey, we found slightly more Californians thought the shifts and cuts were a good idea, while the views on spending reserves were very similar, despite in February the plan's called for drawing down $13.1 billion of the state's reserve, compared to just the $4.2 billion that we see today. So somewhat noteworthy that despite a $9 billion drop, the results in spending reserves are nearly identical. And turning to approval of elected officials, let's just say that Californians are not all that happy today with their elected officials. Overall, we find that approval of Governor Newsom and President Biden are both at record lows. We find that the legislature overall is at a 5-year low, that Congress is at a 10-year low, while while views of those in their own House representatives are at an all-time low. So lots of disapproval in this survey. As you can see, overall, Democrats are much more approving than Republicans for the most part. And in most cases, independents tend to align more with Republicans than Democrats on overall approval of these elected officials. Outside of partisan groups, it is noteworthy that Governor Newsom and President Biden only have approval greater than 60% among Democrats and African Americans. And if we lower that threshold to 50%, we add college graduates to the groups who approve of Newsom, and San Francisco Bay Area residents and those 55 and older of the groups who approve of Biden. So as you can see, there's widespread agreement on approval of both of these elected officials. There are a lot of other topics included in this survey. I really would encourage you to go to our website and look at the crosstabs among all adults and likely voters, and the time trends among those groups as well. There are topics like personal financial situation, satisfaction, views on how much people pay in taxes, the highest priority for state spending, preferences for the size of government, as well as some views on increasing taxes on the wealthiest Californians and the largest corporations. At this time, I definitely encourage you to submit any questions that you have to ppiceventquestions@gmail.com. And at this point, I will stop sharing my screen and welcome Lauren back to discuss some key takeaways.
Hi, thank you so much, Dean, for that excellent and very, very informative presentation. And we just want to take a few minutes to talk about some important key takeaways. And I want to get a bit more into some topics from this survey that Dean wasn't able to touch upon in his slideshow. And that is taxes and the size of government. So Californians were asked when they combine all the taxes they pay to state and local governments, if they feel they should, if they're paying more than they should, much more than they should, somewhat more than they should, the right amount, or less than they should. And what we found is 2/3 of Californians feel they're paying either somewhat or much more in taxes than they should. And this includes 40% who feel they're paying much more. Additionally, about 1/4 of Californians say they pay about the right amount of taxes, and 5% say they pay less than they should. And these sentiments are actually similar among California likely voters and all California adults. Taking a look at partisan groups, 54% of Republicans say that they are paying much more in taxes than they should, compared to 4 in 10 independents and 3 in 10 Democrats. However, solid majorities across parties do feel they're paying at least somewhat more in taxes than they should. Then across regions, 65% or more across regions regions of the state say they are paying at least somewhat more in taxes than they feel they should be. This sentiment is highest in Los Angeles at 70%. And then across demographic groups, there is little variance between most demographic groups. 60 and 70% say they are paying somewhat or much more taxes than they should be. So this is something I think most people in California can agree on. Dean, do you have anything to add?
No, I mean, to me, what really struck me was just the pervasive nature of that at least somewhat more category. I mean, the much more, there are some interesting differences, but just it's really pervasive, this idea that Californians believe that we're paying much more than we should. Yeah.
And relatedly, respondents were asked their preference in the size of government by choosing if they'd rather pay higher taxes and have a government that provides more services, or would rather pay lower taxes and have a state government that provides fewer services. And a majority of 56% actually say they prefer a government with lower taxes and fewer services. About 4 and 10% say they prefer a government with higher taxes and more services. This is really interesting because just a few months ago in February 2024, Californians were much more evenly split, with about half saying either of those options. And unsurprisingly, there is a large partisan divide in this preference. 85% of Republicans prefer paying lower taxes and having fewer services in government. A smaller majority, or about 6 and 10 independents, prefer this. And meanwhile, on the other hand, a majority of Democrats say they prefer higher taxes with more services. Majorities across regions and most demographic groups do prefer less services and lower taxes, with a few exceptions. Residents with incomes below 40K are almost split 50-50 on which option they prefer. And also 50% of African Americans prefer to have higher taxes with more services, while 45% prefer the opposite of lower taxes and less services. And overall, this is actually the highest share of Californians saying they prefer paying taxes and having fewer services since we first asked this question back in February 2003. So in the last 20 years. And the share was only exceeded 50% once before in February 2023. I'd say right now it's unclear whether this is just a sign of the times with all these other economic and financial worries that we are seeing in other parts of this survey. But I think it'll be really interesting to see how this reading changes over time. And so I really wanted to take time to highlight that. Dean, do you have anything to add?
Yeah, I mean, to me, this is just a really surprising, because it did increase seven points from just February, which is noteworthy. Last February, it was 52%. And that was the kind of first time we asked that in our online panel. Prior to that, we had always asked it in random digit dialing phone surveys on cell phones and landlines. And for the most part, we often found a closely divided. And so I'll be interested in continue to track this on the online methodology, just to see if this is kind of a blip and it maybe reverts back to what we were seeing more of in prior years. But it's really noteworthy. 56% to me, that's one of the biggest numbers in this survey for sure. So
Yeah.
Thank you for highlighting that.
Yeah, of course. We are going to turn to some questions now. And at this time, if you would like to go ahead and wait. As a reminder, you can still submit your questions to ppiceventquestions@gmail.com. And we do have a question from Travis Gilmore, who is a journalist at the Epoch Times. It appears that no questions were asked regarding the Homelessness, Drug Addiction, and Death Reduction Act, which is now eligible for the ballot. Will PPIC be including such inquiries in any surveys before November?
Yeah, regarding that specific ballot measure, as we always do prior to our fall surveys, we will take a look at everything on the ballot and definitely consider what we're going to ask. It's always tough choices, especially in a year like this where it looks like there's going to be a bunch. Obviously, we have done a lot of work on these topics, especially if you go back to our December 2023 survey, where we took a pretty in-depth look at homelessness as well as kind of drug addiction as well. And so that's definitely something we'll be looking for.
Definitely, and thank you for that question. Next question. This survey shows sizable leads for Democrats across the presidential race, Senate race, and overall preference for House seats. Are there any particular regions of the state where you see the story differing from the overall finding?
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question. I think overall, it's kind of the easiest way to say is that kind of the coastal counties or coastal areas So if we're looking at our major regions, we're talking the San Francisco Bay Area, Los Angeles, and Orange, San Diego. If you look at the crosstabs for those three regions, they tend to have much higher support for the Democratic candidate, whether it be presidential, Senate, or the generic House race. Where the Inland Empire and Central Valley are more divided, and in some cases are supporting the Republican candidate. And we have a variable we always create every survey, just looking at coastal counties. So any coastal county. And when we looked at all three of these questions, the crosstabs showed like a 30-point margin in these counties for the Democratic support. So it's really along the coast. Yeah. Anything to add, Lauren?
No, that was really interesting insight. Thank you, Dan. Our next question, in this highly consequential election year, your survey shows that Californians are concerned about the direction of the United States. How does this view compare with sentiments nationally? I can go ahead and take this question. So this is an interesting question because there are multiple pollsters asking this question out there on the national scale, from NBC News, New York Times. The poll that I'm particularly familiar with is by AP, the Associated Press, and the Newark Research Center at Chicago. Sorry, Newark Research Center at the University of Chicago. So I'm going to use them as a comparison to our survey. I believe in their April 2024 survey, they found that 76% of Americans say that the country is heading in the wrong direction. And that's very similar to what we find. I think we had a 75 or 74% who said this in our June survey. And what's interesting is that they do ask this question. AP Newark does ask this question several times a year. And since the summer of 2021, their findings have tended to fluctuate between 70 and 80%. And that's very similar to what we have found in the last year as well. So again, Californians are kind of right on trend to Americans overall when it comes to the direction of the nation. Jane, do you have anything to add?
Yeah, I'll just say that, this used to be an issue where if there was a Democratic president, that the views among Californians, given it's so many Democrats in the state, were more positive than the adults overall in the nation. So to me, this is a really interesting kind of a finding. And so it's a little bit of a change from what we've generally seen. And we've seen that at both the national questions and the state questions on kind of the direction as well. Depending on whose party is in power, there's this little bit of kind of preference to say good times or bad times or right direction or wrong direction based on who's in power. But this is really interesting because Californians are, just as you said, just as negative as Americans overall. And that to me is really striking.
Definitely. Looks like we have another question. At the national level, there has been a fair amount of attention paid to the presidential candidacy of Robert Kennedy Jr. Does your survey responses shed any light on his potential appeal as an alternative to the two major party candidates?
Well, as I highlighted, there are 13% of likely voters currently saying that they would support someone else. And so when you dig into those verbatim responses on kind of who else they would say, there's a lot of folks saying anyone else, a lot of folks who name, things like myself or another candidate who's not running for office per se. But there was a decent share of folks, just over 2% of folks, who did mention Kennedy. And so there is at least some low support for him. But I would say that most of the folks of that 13% were people kind of saying anyone else, or even some folks who might say, I'm going to vote for someone else. I'm just not sure yet. And so overall, there is some support, but I do think that, at this point, and when we're not naming candidates, it's hard to see. but beginning in the fall, we will be naming at least some third party or lower party candidates. And sorry, by that I mean independents. And we'll also be including the vice presidential nominees for those folks, as well as for Biden and Trump as well. And so there'll be a little bit a change in the way we approach that coming up after the conventions are held.
Yeah, definitely something to look forward to. We have a question from William Tamayo. Was there a survey conducted on the proposal to eliminate the Proposition 13 tax method?
I'm not exactly sure at what he's referencing, but I will use this opportunity to say that we did ask if folks thought that Proposition 13 was a good thing or a bad thing, and found that 65% of Californians say that it's mostly turned out to be a good thing. And so, and it's often called the third rail of California politics. So I guess all I would say on that is that any proposal to touch Proposition 13 would likely at least begin with a little bit of uphill battle, I would say.
Thank you. Thank you for your answer. And next question, and this might be our last question. The share of Californians saying the state is headed in the wrong direction is larger than it has been in more than a decade. What do you see as driving this level of pessimism? I can start answering this question. So we do see a solid majority of Californians saying the state is going in the wrong direction. I believe it's 62%. And the share has grown slowly over the past year. I believe in June 2023, we saw that 54% of Californians felt the state was going in the wrong direction, which was actually the first time that share had been more than 50% since October 2012, so over 10 years. And what could possibly be some reasons for this? Well, I can't pinpoint obviously the exact causes for this, but I can use our survey data to hopefully gain some insight on why some people might be feeling this way. And I guess I'm going to start with the most important issue facing the state. And we have seen that inflation, economy, jobs, cost of living, and then housing costs and availability, and then homelessness have consistently been named our top 3 issues since May of 2022, so for the past 2 years. And just taking some data points on these questions, on these 3 issues, can help explain maybe some pessimism. So first, looking at economy, according to this June survey, 68% of Californians expect bad economic conditions in the next year. 36% feel they are financially worse off than a year ago personally. About a third are not satisfied with their household's financial situation, and more than half are very concerned about the price of consumer goods in this country. So a lot of worries and pessimism there. And now regarding housing, more than half of Californians do report the cost of housing placing financial strain on them and their families. According to our December statewide survey, an overall majority found that felt that housing affordability was a big problem in their part of California. And then regarding homelessness, in the December survey as well, 64% thought homelessness was a big problem in their part of the state. 10% report having had experienced homelessness themselves. And 7 in 10 say they see someone experiencing homelessness at least every few days. So there's all these big issues that are on Californians' mind, and we're consistently seeing majorities of Californians viewing this as negatively affecting their day-to-day lives. And of course, again, I can't speak for every single person in California, but it seems like putting all this together can help paint a picture of why a majority of Californians think the state is going in the wrong direction. And we're almost out of time. Dean, do you have anything to add to that?
No, I think that's great. I think it's just probably a whole bunch of things that are stacking on top of one another. I would also mention our well-being survey from November that showed that there's a sizable share of people worried about things like the cost of housing, the cost of healthcare, all of these different things that we're seeing. And so I think you did a good job of laying out a lot of these reasons that, and as you said, we can't pinpoint that's why, because we didn't ask them why. But I think these are all things that have to be stacking up for most Californians.
Yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely. So it seems we've reached the end of our program. I want to thank Dean again so much for your wonderful presentation. And I would also like to thank again our funders, the RJR and Francis F. Miller Foundation and the PPIC Corporate and Donor Circles. And of course, thanks to all of you for joining us today online. We would appreciate you taking a moment to give us your feedback on this event. Please scan the QR code on the screen and complete the short survey. Again, thank you so much and have a great afternoon.